Most people assume that choosing to stay home alone means someone is antisocial, shy, or going through something. But what if the opposite is true? What if staying in, quietly, intentionally, is actually a sign of evolution rather than avoidance? Carl Jung hinted that when consciousness expands, the outer world becomes too loud, too rigid, and the inner world suddenly feels like the only place where truth can breathe. It's a paradox. While society praises the hustle, spiritually awake people begin craving silence, depth, and space. Maybe you've felt that shift yourself. One day, the same places, conversations, and rhythms that once thrilled you begin to feel heavy. Loud rooms drain you. Empty small talk feels like emotional static. You're not bored, you're becoming more self-aware. Jungian psychology suggests that when the unconscious mind rises, it pulls your attention inward, toward shadow work, dream interpretation, symbols and meaning that reveal who you really are beneath the persona. And quietly, a new question forms inside. What if home is the safest doorway to myself? This movement toward solitude doesn't mean something is wrong. In fact, it often means something is finally right. Because while most people look outside for answers, spiritually awake souls begin uncovering them within. Home becomes less about four walls and more about a space where the human psyche can breathe without performing, where emotional awareness and healing the inner child unfold naturally, without witnesses. You start noticing how peace expands inside you, how your consciousness reacts differently, how the power of the mind begins guiding you rather than sabotaging you. The truth is, the more someone awakens, the less they need distraction. Noise loses its charm. Stillness becomes magnetic. And what once felt like loneliness now feels like alignment. It's an inner shift so subtle that only those walking this path truly understand. Little by little, you're drawn back to your own center, as if life is inviting you to listen more deeply. There comes a moment in spiritual awakening when sensitivity rises like a quiet tide. Sounds feel louder, conversations hit deeper, and everyday life begins revealing symbols and meaning hidden beneath the obvious. Jungian psychology called this subtle stirring the unconscious mind nudging us toward self-awareness. People feel themselves drawn inward, not out of fear but curiosity, as if a soft inner voice whispers guidance that only silence can translate. Suddenly, solitude feels natural. The outside world doesn't lose value. It just becomes secondary to the inner transformation happening beneath the surface. This is where emotional awareness begins to bloom, where light and darkness reveal themselves gently, without pressure. And although nothing looks different on the outside, inside, everything is changing. As this spiritual awakening unfolds, being alone stops feeling awkward. It becomes a return to one's internal axis, the center. Someone might notice they no longer crave constant company. They'd rather walk alone through a neighborhood park, listening to that inner voice of the self. It isn't isolation. It's alignment. A quiet evening sketching thoughts, journaling dreams, or practicing shadow work can feel more fulfilling than the busiest social night. Jung and modern psychology remind us that individuation process requires moments of stillness, time to meet the persona and shadow honestly. A spiritually awake person understands this intuitively. Stepping back from the noise isn't withdrawal, it's preparation. And it feels oddly right. In those quiet moments, the mind begins to soften. Thoughts that once ran wild finally slow down. Emotions reorganize themselves like books placed gently back on the shelf. Someone might sit under a tree, simply breathing, realizing how the power of the mind can transform chaos into inner alchemy. Their intuition sharpens. They start recognizing symbols in everyday life, synchronicity explained through tiny clues, a repeated number, a dream symbol, a memory resurfacing at the perfect time. Simple actions, like a long shower or a walk at sunrise, become rituals of healing the inner child, releasing the repressed self, and facing one's shadow. And it all happens slowly, almost effortlessly. This solitude has little to do with walls or location. It's a movement inward. A person might feel more connected sitting alone in a cafe with headphones than surrounded by friends at a loud dinner. That's because consciousness begins turning from external to internal landscapes. They begin recognizing psychological archetypes playing out in their relationships, noticing projection and perception shaping how they see others. They start asking deeper questions. What is the meaning of life? Who am I beneath all roles? What does my soul actually want? These questions don't demand immediate answers. They simply quiet the noise so truth can emerge. And in this quiet, the hero's journey truly begins. Here, solitude becomes a teacher. It reveals the shadow in relationships, guiding one to recognize patterns like narcissism and the unconscious emotional wounds that often shape love. It also invites practices, like dream interpretation, mindful movement, or simply sitting with one's breath, to deepen emotional alchemy. One person shared how running alone at dawn helped her listen to herself again. Another said taking solo hikes made her feel more alive than any conversation. These aren't escapes, they are returns. Returns to the self, to the unseen inner voice that knows where growth is waiting. And slowly, as this new relationship with solitude strengthens, something else begins to unravel, the persona that once defined everything. Carl Jung once described the persona as a social mask, an image we polish to be accepted, loved, or simply tolerated. It's the version of ourselves we present at work, at family dinners, or even on social media. For years, it feels normal, until spiritual awakening cracks it open. Suddenly, smiling just to be polite feels draining. Pretending to be fine becomes exhausting. Behind the mask, the unconscious mind begins signaling that something deeper wants to emerge. This is where Jungian psychology calls us inward, into a more honest relationship with the human psyche. Light and darkness begin to show themselves more clearly, and the desire for self-awareness becomes irresistible. Something inside whispers, you can drop the act. It's safe now. As the persona dissolves, superficial interactions lose their charm. Conversations about trends, gossip, and small talk begin to feel hollow, almost painful. Someone might leave a social gathering feeling more alone than before. This happens because shadow work is quietly uncovering what lies beneath: core needs, emotional awareness, and vulnerabilities they've hidden for years. The unconscious pushes for inner transformation, nudging them toward healing the inner child and the repressed self. It's not that other people suddenly become boring. It's that depth psychology awakens new hunger, one for meaning, symbols, and authentic connection. A short, honest conversation with one person suddenly feels more nourishing than hours with many. That's how the individuation process reconfigures priorities, all without trying. In solitude, authenticity becomes effortless. Alone, no performance is needed, no charm, no filters, no overly rehearsed scripts. It's just the self, raw, tender, honest. Someone might notice they laugh differently when they are alone, more freely. They move slower, breathe deeper, and connect to the power of the mind without external expectations. Journaling, for example, becomes a sacred dialogue with the inner voice of the self. Dream interpretation reveals symbols and meaning that would be overlooked in busier days. Even quietly cooking dinner becomes emotional alchemy, a way to integrate shadow and light without resistance. In these small acts, people realize they never needed an audience to be real. And here's the paradox. Choosing solitude isn't about isolation. It's liberation from the compulsive need to please. When someone stops performing, relationships naturally shift. Some friendships fade because they were built on the persona, not the soul. Others deepen because they welcome this new truth. Jung and modern psychology remind us that projection and perception play powerful roles here. As we change, how we see others changes, too. The shadow in relationships becomes clearer, especially dynamics shaped by narcissism and the unconscious desire to be validated. Letting go can be scary, but it's also profoundly freeing. It creates space for people who resonate with authenticity rather than performance. This inner freedom invites a new simplicity. Being alone no longer feels like withdrawing. It feels like returning home to oneself. There's no pressure to impress, explain, or justify. Someone might spend a quiet afternoon reading about psychological archetypes, practicing shadow integration techniques, or reflecting on the hero's journey unfolding inside them. And in these moments, they sense how this journey is shaping their consciousness, guiding them towards symbols, synchronicity explained through subtle signs, and the alchemy of trauma becoming wisdom. The more the persona falls away, the clearer everything becomes, especially the pull toward creating a personal sanctuary where true growth can happen next. For many who undergo spiritual awakening, home slowly transforms from a simple living space into a sacred sanctuary. Walls that once felt ordinary begin holding symbols and meaning, objects that mirror the unconscious mind, candles, plants, journals, crystals, or a favorite chair by the window. It's not about decor, it's about energy. Jungian psychology teaches that individuation process requires safety, a place where one can meet both light and darkness without fear. At home, people feel free to explore shadow work, dream interpretation, and emotional awareness in ways public spaces rarely allow. Even brewing tea becomes a moment of inner transformation, grounding the human psyche before the day begins. And the more conscious a person becomes, the more they protect this sacred ground. Inside this sanctuary, they can finally control the energy. The world outside is fast, chaotic, driven by persona and expectations. At home, consciousness slows down. Many create simple rituals, lighting a candle before journaling, sitting in silence at sunrise, smudging their space, reading Carl Jung by the window, pulling cards for archetypes in everyday life. These aren't just routines, they are emotional alchemy, ways of communicating with the deeper layers of the unconscious. Someone might keep a dream notebook by the bed, ready to decode Jungian dream symbols that reveal messages from the inner voice of the self. Here, healing the inner child happens naturally, gently, and in that softness, the shadow in relationships becomes easier to understand. Home also becomes a space where the nervous system can rest. After interacting with the intensity of projection and perception out in society, spiritually awake people return home not just to relax, but to recalibrate. They might take long showers to wash away emotional residue, practice breathwork in the living room, or cook a nourishing meal as an act of psychological care. Studies in environmental psychology have shown that organized, aesthetically pleasing environments can reduce stress and increase emotional stability, almost like a quiet form of therapeutic depth psychology. Researchers at Princeton University, for example, observe that cluttered spaces can compete for attention, making it harder for the mind to process information. When the home feels intentional, the power of the mind expands with ease. Because of that, caring for this sanctuary becomes a spiritual ritual of its own. It isn't about following trends. It's about decorating with consciousness. Many choose objects not for beauty alone, but for what they represent inside the unconscious mind. A candle may symbolize light and darkness coexisting. A painting may reflect psychological archetypes. A wooden bowl may remind them of the hero's journey grounding into the physical world. Items that carry emotional resonance, mementos from travels, books that marked a season of growth, notes from mentors, crystals gifted by a friend, can be placed in intentional spaces. An altar, a bedside table, a shelf dedicated to symbols and meaning. One might create thematic corners. A meditation nook with cushions, incense, and a journal for dream interpretation. A creativity altar holding meaningful images, poems, or archetypes in everyday life. A sacred shelf where personal symbols rest, stones, letters, or small sculptures. Even color choices influence emotional awareness. Soft greens may encourage healing the inner child. Blues invite consciousness and calm. Warm yellows remind the mind of inner transformation through light. Plants support emotional alchemy. They serve as reminders of growth and the individuation process unfolding slowly but consistently. Lighting also becomes symbolic. Warm lamps instead of harsh overhead lights. Candles used intentionally during shadow work or reflection. Some people rotate objects based on seasons or cycles, adding fresh flowers in spring, dream symbols near the bed during full moons, or journals placed near windows to catch morning light. The whole house becomes a living dialogue with the unconscious mind. Here, being at home doesn't always mean being alone. Families cook together, but with quieter hearts. Partners rest in the same room, each doing their own inner work. Children play, yet the environment feels held, safe, intentional. The house becomes a container where light and darkness coexist without fear. It holds room for Jung and modern psychology, for symbols and meaning, for spiritual awakening and the collective unconscious dancing subtly in daily life. Even small rituals, like watering plants, burning incense, or reading about shadow integration techniques, strengthen the connection between soul and space. Slowly, the home evolves into a place where healing through awareness happens naturally, becoming the nest preparing them for what comes next. Inner work that deepens beyond the visible. Inner work is delicate. Shadow, healing, and integration need stability, like a candle flame that only reveals its full light when sheltered from the wind. Jungian psychology reminds us that the unconscious mind opens slowly, and only when it feels safe enough to reveal what has been repressed. That's why home becomes more than a structure. It becomes the ideal container for emotional awareness and the individuation process. Within familiar walls, the human psyche knows it can explore light and darkness without judgment. Here, one begins noticing psychological archetypes arising spontaneously, the orphan longing for belonging, the sage offering wisdom, the wounded healer seeking to turn pain into inner transformation. And when these inner figures finally speak, it helps to be somewhere quiet, where nothing interrupts their voice. Because home offers protection from external noise, spiritually awake people discover they can go deeper without distraction. There's no persona to perform, no social scripts to maintain. They might sit quietly in their room and feel old emotions resurfacing, anger, grief, fear, each one tied to a piece of the repressed self. In public, these feelings might be suppressed to keep up appearances. But at home, consciousness has no audience. It can simply be. One woman once shared that sitting alone on her couch helped her understand patterns of projection and perception that shaped all her relationships. She could finally see the shadow in relationships and name where narcissism and the unconscious had influenced her choices. Without interruption, clarity rises faster. Truth reveals itself gently but unmistakably. In this fertile quiet, micro-rituals are born. They don't need to be elaborate, just consistent. Someone may meditate after breakfast, read a few pages of Jung and modern psychology at noon, then journal dream interpretation symbols before bed. Others prefer silent mornings with tea, letting synchronicity explained through everyday signs guide their day. Writing is especially powerful. When pen meets paper, emotional alchemy begins. A simple prompt such as "Where did my shadow appear today?" can open doors into the unconscious mind. And for those beginning to heal the inner child, drawing or coloring can be surprisingly revealing. These rituals serve as anchors, reminding consciousness to keep returning inward. They create safety, and safety is what allows the inner voice of the self to speak. Soon, the house feels less like a retreat and more like a laboratory for inner alchemy. The living room becomes a meditation hall. The bedroom becomes a dream temple where Jungian dream symbols offer invisible guidance. The kitchen becomes a space of grounding, where cooking takes on symbolic meaning. Transforming raw ingredients into nourishment mirrors transforming trauma into wisdom. Someone practicing shadow integration techniques might keep a special notebook on the nightstand to record symbols, archetypes in everyday life, or insights from the hero's journey as it unfolds. Even silence becomes a tool. Sitting in stillness helps the fragmented self begin to reassemble. This environment doesn't force transformation. It simply welcomes it, like soil inviting seeds to open. And there's something else. The more someone practices inner work at home, the more they begin to notice subtle shifts in their energy. They might wake up with a sense of intuitive knowing, the unconscious mind offering guidance through emotion rather than logic. They might feel called to rearrange their space, clearing corners that feel heavy or adding symbols and meaning that reflect where they are in the individuation process. A client once shared that after a deep meditation, she felt compelled to move her desk near a window, and from that day on, her journaling became richer and more honest. Small adjustments like this often reflect psychological projection in love, career, and purpose. Inner transformation mirrored externally. Inner work at home also invites practical care. Someone might create a weekly rhythm. Sundays for reviewing dreams and synchronicity, Wednesdays for reading about Jung and spirituality, Fridays for emotional release techniques like movement or breath work. Even chores become meditative. Sweeping becomes emotional awareness. Folding clothes becomes symbolic integration. Washing dishes becomes mindfulness. These tiny practices soften resistance, making the shadow less frightening. Over time, a person learns how to face their shadow without judgment, seeing it not as an enemy but as a teacher holding keys to the meaning of life. As inner work deepens, the home becomes attuned, not just emotionally, but physically. Lighting is softer. Noise reduces. Objects gain placement and purpose. There's a shelf for their favorite books, a small mix of depth psychology, spiritual awakening reflections, myths from the hero's journey. A plant that thrived during a difficult season becomes a reminder of resilience. A candle that burns during meditation becomes a companion. These items hold emotional resonance. They become symbols of the unconscious and the self working together. The house responds to consciousness. It adapts to support healing through awareness. With time, the home reflects the inner process. Books pile up like breadcrumbs of consciousness. Candles burn low during emotional alchemy. Pillows are rearranged after meditative nights. A new plant appears after healing a difficult wound. The house becomes a mirror of progress, each corner holding traces of growth. And because this work is intimate, slow, and sacred, it rarely demands an audience. It simply needs nurturing. One begins to understand that inner transformation doesn't require distance from the world. It requires depth. And depth blooms strongest where peace is present. As this inner laboratory evolves, something stirs inside, a quiet readiness to eventually step beyond the sanctuary into selective and purposeful connection. After a season of inner retreat, something subtle shifts. The unconscious mind, once calling inward for healing, begins gently nudging outward again. But this return is nothing like before. It's quieter, slower, guided. Jungian psychology would say the individuation process has reached a new stage, one where the self feels strong enough to engage with the world without losing itself. Now, connection is intentional, not habitual. The human psyche, having practiced emotional alchemy at home, naturally seeks others who honor both its light and darkness. It's not a grand re-entry, it's a selective unfolding. The person steps outside with presence, choosing experiences that feel aligned with their spiritual awakening and inner transformation. They go out less, not from fear or disinterest, but from clarity. They've tasted peace at home, within their sanctuary, and now measure every plan against that inner quiet. When they choose to leave the house, it's often for meaningful encounters rather than entertainment for entertainment's sake. A long walk with a thoughtful friend feels richer than a crowded party. A quiet dinner with someone who understands Jung and modern psychology feels more nourishing than a loud gathering. It's the same world, but navigated differently. The persona has softened. The shadow in relationships is recognized sooner. Projection and perception are better understood. And so life becomes simpler, not smaller, but more refined. Naturally, relationships shift. The emotionally aware person finds themselves drawn to souls whose values mirror their own, individuals curious about consciousness, inner alchemy, and the meaning of life. Conversations deepen. Instead of small talk, they explore archetypes in everyday life, synchronicity explained through recent experiences, or stories of healing the inner child. They don't need others to be perfect, only honest. New friendships may bloom from unexpected places. An online course on Jungian psychology, a meditation circle, a book club discussing the hero's journey. Each connection feels like recognition rather than discovery, as if the collective unconscious orchestrated the meeting. These relationships nourish, expand, and feel spiritually compatible. The home and solitude remain foundations, but now the balance is wiser. They may spend mornings journaling dream interpretation symbols, afternoons sharing tea with a friend, evenings meditating alone. They no longer abandon themselves to belong. Time alone still serves as emotional alchemy, releasing, integrating, rebalancing any energy gathered outside. They know how to return to their inner voice of the self, how to face their shadow when triggered, and how to protect the power of the mind when the world feels loud. The sanctuary remains a touchstone. When life becomes overwhelming, they return home not to escape, but to remember. Solitude is no longer an occasional practice. It's a lifestyle that makes connection richer. There is an ease now. They know that growth isn't about disappearing forever. It's about returning rooted. They understand that the wounded healer within rests and gathers strength in solitude, then shares that wisdom selectively. They go out not to perform, but to express, not to seek approval, but to witness life with new eyes. And when they speak, their words come from a deeper place, shaped by shadow integration techniques, emotional awareness, and the inner transformation that unfolded within their four walls. Every interaction feels like an opportunity to embody what they've learned. And slowly, the journey expands again, preparing the mind and soul for what comes next. Stories, encounters, and lessons that will open new doors on the path of consciousness. At the end of the day, solitude isn't a retreat from life. It's a return to yourself. When you honor your inner world, the outer world finally begins to make sense. So take a moment. Notice where your soul feels safest. Listen to the quiet. Trust the unconscious. Your home, your sanctuary, might be the doorway you've been searching for. If this message resonated with you, drop a comment below and share your experience. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. There's so much more waiting for you on this journey within.